So as Martin said, I'm Nicolas Sera-Leyva, and I work with a local NGO here in Beirut called SMEX. A lot of the work that SMEX does is focused on the intersection of human rights and the internet, or in a phrase that we like to refer to it as digital rights. We do work around monitoring violations of digital rights. We do research on digital rights developments here in the Middle East and North Africa region. And we also do work on digital safety and security training. So before I talk about some of that work, what I actually wanted to do is start the talk off on a slightly more conceptual note, let's say. So I want everybody to think for just a second about the word identity and what the word identity means to you. So, as humans, our identities have always been very deeply intricate. It's a sense of self that's simultaneously constant, and it's also constantly evolving. Individually, our singular identity is in fact an identity of identities that's basically based on how we internalize the ways that people perceive us versus the ways that we perceive ourselves to be in that same light. So our identities are immense and complicated things. And the same can be very easily said about the internet. The internet is a globe-spanning network of information and hardware that is as physical as it is conceptual. And now, more than ever before, human identity and the internet have become inextricably intertwined. And the relationship between them has almost become symbiotic. This is especially true when it comes to the topic of maintenance. We use the internet to maintain our identities, but also in many ways, our identities maintain and shape the internet. So, as I'm sure is the case with everybody here in this room, I've moved through a number of different identities myself over the years. Over the past 10 years, I've gone from being a painter to a fashion blogger to a movie publicist, and then to a digital security trainer and advocate in the human rights and technology sector, because life is funny that way. So I am all of those things individually by virtue of having once been them and lived those experiences myself, but I'm also the sum of all of these things collectively. This collection of experiences forms just a small part of who I am. It doesn't even account for all the other identities and experiences beyond my professional trajectory that make me me. My point is that as humans, we contain multitudes. We're incredibly rich and complicated creatures, and much of that is because of our ability to maintain this individual sense of identity. So, in the 7 years that I've been working in the human rights and technology realm, my focus has been primarily on user education, and specifically digital security. From facilitating workshops on digital security for journalists and activists at risk around the world, to analyzing the different ways that we teach people about digital security. So for example, how do we teach people to use strong passwords? How do we teach people to encrypt their hard drives? Or how do we teach people about staying safe and anonymous while browsing the internet? And how do we do this in a way that isn't just instructional, but also allows them and encourages them to adopt new habits and practices that can make them safer when they're using the internet? So a topic that comes up time and time again in these trainings is the topic of identity protection in an online context. These are people who've been impersonated or had their identity stolen because somebody was able to hack into and then hijack their personal Facebook account. These are people who are spooked by online advertisements, selling them something that they probably only searched for once in passing and are now wondering what else the internet knows about them. These are people who may live as one person in the real world, but in fact have entire personal or professional lives as somebody completely different online in order to protect themselves from harm. Ultimately, these are people who want to preserve their autonomy and agency over these virtual extensions of their physical selves. That we possess these virtual appendages and these reconstructions of ourselves is something that we mostly take for granted now, but I think it's also really important for us to take a step back and ask ourselves how we got here in the first place. So it goes without saying that the advent of the internet radically altered our perception of identity, both as individuals and as a global society. And the internet very quickly became a sort of clay out of which we were able to reconstruct identities of our own design in a way that we had never been able to before, regardless of who we were or where we were in the physical world. So the anonymity and plasticity of this virtual space gave us a radical new ability to reinvent ourselves. We use the internet to project ourselves to faraway people and places. We use the internet to develop and grow ourselves by consuming vast new quantities of information that we previously had never had any access to. And it opened up a whole new world of possibilities, and these possibilities almost seemed limitless. But as society evolved together with the internet, the line between our physical selves and our virtual selves began to blur. First, in the mid-90s, targeted online advertising emerged, and with companies quickly realizing that in order to fully leverage the power of the internet as a sales vehicle, they needed to make sure that they were putting their products in front of the right eyeballs. This quickly evolved into the online advertising industry that we know today, which is built on gathering data about our activities and behaviors online, and essentially synthesizing these into algorithmic versions of ourselves that companies can sell things to. Then, in the early to mid-2000s, came social media platforms. And social media platforms further blurred this line between the physical and the digital by providing us with these easy-to-use, shareable buckets, or as we know them, profiles, into which we could basically dump curated expressions of ourselves that we could then export as identities to share with the rest of the world. So soon, we began cramming our multitudes as humans into these one-size-fits-all virtual templates. Our likes, our dislikes, our opinions, and our relationships, all of this personal data about us available in an easy one-stop shop. And the more present we became online, the more data about ourselves we generated. And the more data about ourselves that we generated, the bigger and more sophisticated our data footprints became. So now, fast forward to today, to 2019, the age of artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things. We've successfully taught computers to mimic our behavior, to observe our expressions and our language, and to replicate our decision-making capacities. The internet has moved beyond the realm of smartphones and laptops and into flat-screen televisions, wristwatches, home thermostats, you name it. And what's kind of scary is, the internet knows what movies you like. It knows how cold you like your water. It listens to you breathe and it watches you sleep at night. And all of this constant stream of data that we're generating more and more of every day lives on servers that we have no access to. So in 2014, an American sociologist named Shoshana Zuboff coined and popularized the term surveillance capitalism. Surveillance capitalism is a term that's basically used to describe the commodification of personal data, and it highlights how the means used to gather this data in the first place is essentially in and of itself a form of mass surveillance. And that surveillance is conducted in the name of generating profit for private sector companies. As Zuboff put it, we are talking about the unilateral claiming of private human experience as raw material for product development and market exchange. And two of the most egregious culprits of this are online advertising companies and social media platforms. The damaging effects of surveillance capitalism are many, and these have largely been enabled by the relatively unregulated and unmanaged operating environment that the online advertising industry has been allowed to mature in. The data gathered about us, the algorithms and artificial intelligence that are constantly learning from us can be easily abused. With few ethical standards around online advertising content, for instance, disinformation can be more easily disseminated. Platforms can effectively assign users a race based on their activity data and then promote ads to them based on this externally imposed identity. Certain search engine results can be promoted over others or even hidden altogether, in essence prioritizing sales over truth. And right now, today in 2019, there are nearly 4 billion people that are connected to the internet. And every day, those 4 billion people generate nearly 2.5 quintillion bytes of new data every day. To put that into perspective, that's 40,000 Google searches per second. It's 50,000 Instagram posts in a minute, and a staggering 60 million Tinder swipes in an hour. And some 90% of the data that exists today was generated within the last 2 to 3 years. And enormous quantities of this data is about us. And it's being used, whether by humans or by machines, to understand us, to learn about us, and to assign us identities for different purposes. Whether or not these identities are congruous with our own perception of our own identity is one thing. But what matters most is that this mosaic of identities has become the engine that powers the way that society and the internet interact and become one. It's no longer just a network of computational power, but a synaptic nervous network of identities. Yours, mine, and everybody else's. And it's important to remember that the internet didn't just suddenly appear one day, right? People built it. We built the internet. And as with most things we make, there are traces of us etched into its very design. And this includes the human reliance on identity to determine value and take decisions based on these determinations. For example, as an introvert, is the value of me standing up here and giving a 20-minute talk to a room full of people worth the anxiety about public speaking? As a Gemini, is the value of a second date with that person from last weekend really worth the fact that they were an Aries? No, not, but that's another story. And as a gay man living in Lebanon, is the value of me being publicly affectionate with my partner worth the risk of getting into trouble? These are identity-based decisions about value that we take every day in the analog world. But now think about all the Instagram followers you have, or all the Facebook friends you have, or the Tinder matches that you have, let's say. Think about all these people that you have met online, but you may never meet in real life. Yet, with these people, you might have an opinion about them, an affinity for them, or even a close and fulfilling relationship. The level of intimacy that we've achieved with these people is the result of a decision that we made at some point, whether we realize it or not, based on an identity that was about them, that was conveyed to us through data in a digital realm. And in many ways, this is reflected in the way that we design the internet to also rely on identity at an architectural level. It's true that, yes, some of this functionality is necessary, but just to mention a few examples, for instance, the variability of the internet to fulfill its most basic function, to transmit data between servers, is predicated on the ability of these servers to sufficiently be able to distinguish themselves from one another in such a way that data can be transmitted properly from point A to point B. And now think about what most of us use the internet for, to access websites. Websites are entire portals into different individual and collective identities, and in many cases have identities themselves. And there's an entire superstructure of the internet, the domain name system, or as it's more commonly referred to by the acronym DNS, that exists solely to govern and assign domain names and web addresses that we use every day to access the identities of others, as well as create our own. So overall, these are some pretty innocuous examples, but let's talk about some not so innocuous examples of the way that some human values are etched into the internet. Can anyone here think of a particularly oppressive and problematic way that humans rely on identity to assign value? Anybody? Racism. Take the example of the commonly used metaphor for describing server or device relationships in a network, where one device has unidirectional control over one or more others, but those other devices have no sway or influence over the actions of that primary device. And this is a relationship that exists in a lot of the technology we use every day. Today, in 2019, the common technical metaphor used to describe this relationship is still master-slave, a master device and a slave device. It's still widely used from everything from hard drives to databases, master hard drives, slave drives, master databases, slave databases. And so let's talk about another example. Let's say you work in an office and your IT person has a firewall installed. And that firewall is instructed to allow access to certain websites and to not allow access to certain other websites. This means that there's a list of blocked websites that is commonly referred to as a blacklist, in which black is connotated with bad or unallowable. And then there's a corresponding list of allowable websites that's called a whitelist, in which white is connotated with good or allowable. In both cases, what we're seeing here is commonly used technical language for the internet, and we're seeing it directly echo oppressive power structures made by humans that are predicated on notions of master and slave. Black is bad, white is good, and other racist constructs. So you see echoes of that side of humanity that creates and reinforces structures of oppression and imposes identities to divide and conquer can be heard even here in the fabric of the internet. Now, am I saying that the internet is itself a racist construct or that the internet is racist? No, I'm not saying that. But the internet is a tool, it's a vessel. It has no agenda other than the agenda that we as humans harness it for. So the point that I'm trying to make is that now, today, the social and conceptual link between human identity and the internet is becoming increasingly unbreakable. And given the way our society functions in the digital age, our identities and how they're expressed have become even more beholden to the power structures and protocols that govern the internet. So I'd like to share a quick quote with you from a fascinating piece of research by Niels ten Over from the University of Amsterdam and Corinne Kath from the Oxford University Internet Institute that's called Research into Human Rights Protocol Considerations. And just for some context, this research analyzes how different internet protocols can positively or negatively impact our ability to exercise our human rights on the internet. Protocols and standards are regularly seen as merely performing technical functions. However, these protocols and standards do not exist outside of their technical context, nor do they exist outside of their political, historical, economic, legal, or cultural context. What this quote is basically stating is that the fundamental protocols that power the internet are not purely technical constructs alone. Remember, as we said, the internet didn't just suddenly appear one day. We built it. Humans built the internet. And every piece of the internet is the result of a decision that a human made. Humans make decisions based on values, and values are part of our identity. Human identities and values are what created society, the good and the bad and the ugly. And human identities also directly inform the fabric of the internet. When the modern internet and the universe of open protocol standards that power it came about, it was hailed as a great enabler of free and open communication. While this certainly remains true, as we've also established, as the internet grew, so did the set of values that it would repeatedly have to compete with. And whether in the interest of money, power, or both, especially in the last decade, we've seen the lengths to which actors, especially governments, will go to restrict people's ability to use the internet as a vehicle for truth and expression. We see this in the way that China has institutionalized surveillance and censorship with the Great Firewall. We saw this in the way that the National Security Agency of the US government essentially piggybacked on the internet to operate a massive global level surveillance network. And we've even seen this just last week in the way that the Sudanese government was able to shut down the nation's internet in an effort to hide atrocities it was committing against its own citizens. In many cases, the kinds of online censorship and surveillance that we hear about today are the result of governments, corporations, and other actors taking advantage of the free and open nature of the fundamental protocols of the internet and turning them against users, thereby violating fundamental human rights. And this is a way that the internet can be abused to maintain power structures or to repair society back to a preferred state, where that preferred state is total control. So this actually kind of harks back a little bit to what Lara was talking about earlier, where maintenance can be seen as a very relative term, depending on who you're talking about. So going back to rights, the ability to freely express our identity, including how and where we express it, is directly tied to our universal rights to free expression, free thought, free opinion, free association, free access to information. It's also directly tied to our right to privacy, choosing how and where we express ourselves and to whom. As we've now seen, the internet unlocked a fuller human potential by allowing for digital expression of our physical selves. And by becoming digital, our identities essentially also became quantifiable as data. And by playing host to this data, the internet unlocked a fuller capitalist potential. It also made it possible for companies to use this data to sell us things. In parallel, the architecture of the internet itself, also in a way powered by the concept of human identity, possesses characteristics in its design that have allowed governments and corporations alike the power to interfere with our access to expression and information. So together, these factors have made for a very precarious digital environment that, if left unmaintained and unattended, will go on to do more to violate our rights to privacy and freedom of expression than uphold them. So as we're all well aware, the theme that we're all here to talk about today is maintenance. And I think most of us here can agree, especially now, that as far as technology and infrastructure are concerned, there are few things that are worth maintaining more than the internet. There's no new internet to replace the current one with. Every precedent that society sets about what is acceptable in terms of its relationship with the internet is rolled over into every future iteration of it and the technology that powers it. So how can the internet be better maintained to defend our human rights and to uphold our fundamental rights to freedom of expression and privacy? So there's maintenance that's done at the technical architectural level. And a lot of you have probably heard me use the term protocol to talk about some of the fundamental architecture of the internet. Sorry, I know I'm almost up. And a few examples of these fundamental protocols are things like HTTP, DNS, like I talked about earlier, VoIP, which is used to govern how voice data is transmitted when using apps such as Skype or WhatsApp. And these and many others are part of a core toolbox of protocols called the Internet Protocol Suite. And at the heart of what keeps these protocols running is an organization that probably not a lot of you have heard of called the Internet Engineering Task Force. And the Internet Engineering Task Force is essentially an international volunteer-powered community of technical experts that are charged with the smooth operation and maintenance of the internet. They act as a global decentralized network of working groups that essentially handle the maintenance and improvement of existing protocols as well as designing and creating new ones. And they also produce research, and an example of that research is what I was just talking about earlier with the research from Niels Tennover and Corin Kaff talking about the human rights protocols of the internet. So there's also a way that a lot of this maintenance takes place at the policy level. A lot of us has probably heard of the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR, which is essentially a policy that was enacted last year that makes it easier, that is meant to make it easier for users to have more control over their data by essentially forcing companies to adhere to it in order to continue doing business in the European Union, which is not a market that a lot of global corporations are really interested in losing. So to wrap it up a little bit, so basically in an ideal world, every person on the planet would have total and complete control over the information that's available about them on the internet. But unfortunately, that's not the world that we live in. We don't always know where our data is stored and for how long. We don't always know if and how it's analyzed. And ultimately, we don't have the ability to maintain or eliminate that data as we so choose. But remember what I was talking about earlier with the limitless possibilities of the internet? Those possibilities and opportunities are still there. And imagine if suddenly tomorrow the internet were to completely disappear. Like not just go down, but completely disappear. Like think of all the relationships that you would lose access to. Think of all the opinions and thoughts you'd no longer be able to share. Think of the communities that would fall apart. It would be total chaos to say the least. But what's important to remember is that the internet is worth fighting for in this regard. And sure, there are things like the IETF and like the GDPR that help maintain the ability of the internet to protect our human rights and also help us maintain the integrity and autonomy over our online identities. But these are just small steps. So ultimately, this is why it's so important for us to be aware of the relationship between our identities and the internet in the first place. And it's this awareness that allows us to demand and promote fuller autonomy over our virtual selves. And this is why it's one of the most crucial kinds of maintenance that we can undertake. Thank you.